much for being here. It's really fantastic to have this opportunity to talk about this topic here in this amazing group of people at this amazing meeting. I want to start this with a little story. We were running for 3 years in a row a game jam together with other Nordic universities, for example, of course, the ITU as well, where students from our universities would come together and we would first discuss what sustainability in games means, and then the students would jam and make games around the topic of sustainability. I opened that game jam also there with a talk about what systemic sustainability could mean, sort of as a part of my developing towards understanding this topic better. And it was a little bit of a talk, yeah, we need to address this sort of on a broader level. And after that, we went all out and sort of decompressed a little bit. And one of the students came to us and she explained that, yeah, she's working with her own indie game studio and they're developing this game for sustainability purposes. And she was talking about it's really exciting and really engaged in her own game and her own topic. But then she also mentioned that's like, yeah, but in the light of these sort of bigger perspectives, we do, of course, know that our studio is funded by Meta, the company behind Facebook, and that it is part of their bigger push of Meta in the European Union to dissuade the EU from passing broader legislation around the influence of platforms in digital platform capitalism. So yeah, we know that our studio, even though we believe in our game, is part of the greenwashing of one of these massive multinational corporations, right? And that really soured the conversation there a little bit. And we was like, okay, yeah, and I don't want to be in that. I don't want to see somebody, like a young creative person, in that situation again, where they believe in their own creative vision and their own creative work, but also understand that in the system that we allow to exist, they are still on some level have to be part of the problem, right? So this is one of the things that made me go, okay, we need to think about this on a systemic level that goes beyond just the individual game, the individual studio, but really the political economy of how we produce this, right? So what I want to talk about today, let's see if we get this to function. Yes, fantastic. Is then from this perspective, what is meaningful sustainability in and through games? And I was stupid enough to also share or add, and let's figure out how we can get there from the place where we are right now. So we will try to do both of these things today before 1 o'clock, but we start with what is meaningful sustainability in and through games. Okay, so but first, real quick, my name is Patrick. Yeah, you know me. I'm at Uppsala University. They are running the master degree. This is me and my family. We were 1.5 years ago now. It's crazy enough to drive with our caravan down to the Mediterranean from Sweden. So that's us there. Talking about carbon footprint, maybe there as well. So we have 6 kids, also, heavily invested into the future in some capacity. So yeah, that's us there. Before I have a PhD in media studies, I wrote my dissertation once upon a time on co-creative design in World of Warcraft. There's a TEDx talk if that interests you. But ever since then, it has been more around sustainability questions. So here at the GDC talk or at something like a keynote for the Sustainability Nexus. And all of these things have been leading up to our book, The Game Needs to Change, towards sustainability in game design. So today I want to basically lean on that a little bit and follow the structure of the book a little bit to see how we can arrive at meaningfully doing something about that. The structure for today is that we have this talk at the first third of the time, then take a break. Then in the second part, have group work where you pick a topic that is close to your own heart or that you're interested in that has to do with systemic sustainability in games. Find others, and we use a canvas and some structured questions to guide you through that and work on how we could address this question on a systemic level. And then in the last part, you present what you have arrived at, and we find out which kind of topics are really so interesting that we want to flock towards them and want to continue doing them for real. So that is the plan for today. What do I mean with systemic sustainability? I'm leaning here quite heavily on the United Nations report, Making Peace with Nature. I think it's like a super interesting document, like hundreds and hundreds of pages, mostly written by nature scientists, but with some very political sections in there as well. Let's zoom in a little bit, hopefully also working on this projector. So here we have in this report mentioning that decades of incremental effort have not done enough to really address the climate crisis because vested and short-term interests often prevail, right? So that is a quite strong language for such a report. And the report claims that only a system-wide transformation will address the climate crisis, and it requires a fundamental change in the technological, economic, and social organization of society, including worldviews, norms, values, and governance. So this is the UN telling us that we need to change everything, right? Like a system-wide transformation, a fundamental change, technological. I mean, that from another perspective, like, right, if an organization like United Nations say we need a system-wide transformation of our economic organization of society, that is about as close as they can get in these texts to capitalism critique, right? That is them saying we need to change the economic system of our society, including governance. It's like, is the UN asking the question, can democracy address the climate crisis? Maybe on some level, right? But they're really saying, yeah, we need to, like, everything, we need to really rethink how we make society on a fundamental level. I think that this resonates in some way with the end of yesterday. The presentation that we heard were, unfortunately, apparently, the only system that made this go around had only 1 billion people on the planet. Like, that is crazy, right? So this is a different way of seeing this very same problem, but not suggesting that we drastically reduce the amount of people that live on this planet, but saying we need to systematically change everything else in order to continue a sustainable life here, right? So this is the perspective on what is systemic change here. The United Nations aren't the only ones that see that. When we talk about games, we already have people that see the same things in the games industry. This is from a report from Game Developer. They are, for example, doing this at GDC. That is from the GDC 2023. In the last 12 months, how successful do you think your company's attempts at environmentalism, sustainability, or carbon offsetting have been? And we see that 27% say it's not at all successful and 29% only slightly successful. And that has all the way at the bottom, right? The amount of people who say not at all successful has grown over 1 year from 10% to 27%. So there's a really big discontent with what the game industry is doing in terms of addressing their own carbon or climate footprint. We have these are from the same report, right? From an industry source. People mentioning in their interviews with Game Developer that carbon offsetting feels like a band-aid on a bleeding wound, and there's not enough done to really work with a processor-intensive game development and maintaining internal networks, right? So the things that we've heard, for example, about Minecraft servers being kept online and how much resources that takes and how we aren't addressing that. From inside the industry, we have an attitude that is first we make money, then we clean up after ourselves, in a way that doesn't really do that. And stressing personal versus collective responsibilities instead of dealing with this on an industry-wide level, right? So this is exactly the thing that we saw there, for example, on the year when I was there at GDC talking. From that talk and that work with Trevin and Clayton has also come the book. They are both also part of they have also are the main authors of the Environmental Game Design Playbook by the International Game Developer Association. Niva and her presentation of the toolkit from yesterday, right, is built or is a further development of that. So that's super cool to see that work. And they are also part of the author group there. This is the same group that has been working, for example, on getting the possibilities even for the Xbox to record what kind of energy it's using, and making that information available to developers so that they can tune their games to be less resource intensive, right? Something like the Echo mode in Call of Duty, which is so far only really blurring out and reducing the resolution of background images while you're in a menu somewhere, but that's still, because it's such a big game, saving a lot of resources. And of course, then we could consider what is the next step? How can we do something like default Echo mode for all games on all consoles? Right? They are still, that's something that they have been doing in the past. They also recently had another game jam from the IGDA Climate Sake, the Regenerate one, and this is a really, really active group, right? So they are, if you aren't already joining that, join it. So yes, from that perspective, bringing it back to what does meaningful climate action then mean based on this need to really address everything? Also, just this little down here notion, again, from United Nations, there's an opposition to change. They point out that somebody is trying to stop us from trying to address the climate crisis. Also a perspective that we're not very often including into what our conversations are around that. So In the book, I've been trying to rephrase or come up with a version of meaningful climate change that would fit to and make this a bit more applicable. So this is my version of this. Meaningful climate action in the games industry means that we need to move from individual to collective responsibility and action. We need to go beyond discursive towards material change. We need to resist greenwashing that purposefully impedes transformative change. And it needs to lead to systemic change in the way we produce society. Right? So it's stressing that it's something that we need to do collectively, not just individual action. It's something that needs to go beyond just talking about it or just thinking about it differently to materially impact the world around us. And it needs to still, in the process of going there, be careful, because greenwashing is just really good at sidelining these kind of efforts and pushing them in other directions. And in the book, I'm trying to give that some sort of shape here. The book is really trying to bring that perspective closer to practice, combine system critique with research and practice here, go beyond greenwashing, and talk about sustainability in and through games, right? So sustainability through games, where the games impact their players to act differently, but also sustainability in how we make games and how the games industry produces its culture itself, right? And as an educator, a big thing was for me also to give better responses and answers to my students, because oftentimes it was getting stuck in, oh, we have all of these problems, we cannot really address them. And when they asked me, okay, so what do we do about it? I couldn't really give them any advice. So it's really still in this journey of saying, okay, how can we make this actionable? Another thing that has come out of the game jams, actually, and this is work with also Hannah from the ITU here, for example, was that talking about these topics, fairly dark, fairly difficult perspectives, did leave those students sometimes in a little bit of a ditch, right? It was like a dark place, but also from there, they got out of that by creating a sort of safe space where they with each other could understand that, yes, at least they share this perspective on how dire the situation is. And through making and working with it, they could work their way out of that sort of dark place by addressing it in a productive way. That is also something that impacts this approach here, that we're trying to also do something about it, right? So create a better space for students or for us to work with this without being stigmatized or without being seen as sort of alarmist or something like that. Okay, so in the book, the first section is speaking about systemic approaches. Then it's talking about sustainability in games and through games, and in the end, about what it means for the people that are working with this. So I want to follow that first section a little bit to structure this talk. The first part, the first chapter here, that's my chapter, is talking about systemic and collective change in practice. I'll get back to that because we will be using that. But section number 2 by Eric McBay and Dr. Eileen Mary Holofka is speaking about games and social movements. That is an interesting connection. We didn't even see that coming so much. When we sent out the call, we got a number of responses that were linking sustainability to social movements. And especially like both of these authors, like Eric has been an author of games about making social movements and practical resistance movements. So that was really interesting to get that. So we get that immediate connection to civic action and games, like really doing something about that. How can games support civic action? How can games model that sort of thing? We also got this chapter from Thorsten Busch, Florence Che, and Tanya Sihvonen, that is explaining the more economic underpinnings of what the sustainability crisis looks like in the games industry. That's where I would like to dive a little bit deeper and add some of my own perspective now. Because yes, we've been hearing about what sustainability in games can mean, but it's not often really drawn up this big picture of what the crisis really even is. Right? So this is the darkest point of this talk. After that, again, we will try to work our way out of this by trying to do something about it, right? So even just considering I have been leaving this one behind, right? Oh yeah, here we go. That's well done. Fantastic. So here we are. This is a coltan mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo. This is one of the mines that has this like sigils for being one of the best places to showcase, right? A validated mining site that respects norms and guaranteed conflict-free minerals, and that's what it looks like, right? So other places look worse. We have, of course, and we are aware of that there are conflict minerals. Oftentimes, this will mean that people are forced at gunpoint into unsafe working conditions to harvest these sort of minerals, and that in the end, the sales of these minerals are supporting the regimes that are forcing people into these sort of working conditions. right? We have, and we all know about the working conditions in the industries that are building the devices that we play on. This is linking back to the stories about the Foxconn Apple factories in China. We have all seen Phone Story as a representation of that, right? Companies that address issues around the working conditions in their factories by installing suicide nets on their factories. So this is the reality of the production of the infrastructure of all the devices that we use, right? And yeah, sure, you can have a fair phone, but in the end, that consumer power thing doesn't do anything. If they buy conflict-free minerals, the few that exist, then the price will rise for the conflict minerals somewhere else, right? That there's no industry, there's no customer solution for that. We know about all of the issues around burnout, churn, and using up workforce in the industry, the ethical issues around educating our students to enter the meat grinder of the games industry and fall out of it somewhere on the other side, or trying to empower them to deal with it. I have students, when we talk about precarity in the classroom, they haven't heard that notion before, and suddenly it was like, Patrick, that describes us, right? It's like, yeah, yes, that is the word for the labor conditions and the immaterial labor in this phase of capitalism. And when I ask them to share conditions of where they've encountered that, we get stories from students that say, yeah, I was working until 3 o'clock in the night in my office, and I was crying because I was so exhausted. And my manager came over and said that he's going to keep me here a little bit longer as a favor to get that weakness out of me, because I'm not good enough to work in this industry yet, right? And that is something that students share in class, right? So that is also part of our industry. We have already heard about the landscapes of e-waste that we are building, that are shipped somewhere else, far away from where we don't need to see it, and where it's not really clear if this is e-waste that comes from gaming hardware or from military hardware. We know that for a long time, gaming has been a secondary market to make money out of the resources of the machines that we're anyways building to guide rockets, and to sort of help make that sort of technology more sustainable in an economic sense, not at all an environmental one. Gaming has been a pathway for building more of the graphics cards that are burning through insane amounts of energy. They have been that sort of crutch, unfortunately, that has led to the rise of crypto and now to the rise of AI, which have replaced gaming as this insane industry of using all of these sort of resources. But gaming was part of that history of building up to that sort of use. And then, of course, we have the cultural side of things. You all know the sort of most obvious example of America's Army, right? One of the most successful recruitment tools, where you can play as an American soldier, and then when you're done with gaming, figure out where the next recruitment center is to join for real. But that's, of course, just one version of it. The more mainstream versions of the normalization of violent conflict as a way of resolving all of these kind of issues, the continued projection of using violence to maintain geopolitical, strategic, and resource access. That is even permeating all of the other hobbies that we might have. Like I really like to play Warhammer and Warhammer 40,000. We have a bunch of miniatures. I do that with my kids. I know, of course, it's both material, as its consequences are, that has big issues with neo-fascist groups and its gaming communities, and this representation of racism and otherness in ways that are deeply uncomfortable. It's massively sexist, and it's a continuation of Kriegsspiel, which of course originally was a planning tool for war, which wargaming was for educating officers. Now on Gotland, with the NATO having come in, we have the Swedish Army and the Swedish Defense College again playing a lot of real war games with their officers, where our island features prominently because it's a strategic point in the Baltic Sea in the defense against Russia. So these games are still around. They've never gone anywhere, and that's a bigger place for, if you want to work as a games researcher in Sweden, this is right now where there's open positions, right? So then we've already seen 4X games in the representation, and even taking up to interstellar levels, but of course also encoding the colonialist exploitation of the planet and the people, and oftentimes not even modeling individual human beings, but just states and resources and the conflict there. But even games like the otherwise more and more open and sort of safe space of Dungeons and Dragons and pen and paper role-playing games have their origins in military planning games, right? So both from the material side, but also from a cultural side, a lot of gaming has its origin in war. And it comes full circle when we end up paying the warlords that are forcing people into mines to get us the resources we need to play our games and build our devices, and we pay them with guns to maintain their control over this population, right? This is something that relevant researchers have known for a long time. So this is a paper from 2008, where Mobutu's Congo had been a Cold War ally against communism in Africa, and Kazakhstan, a Soviet weapons depot, both have assumed new roles in a digital economy where cell phones and gaming stations are traded for weapons, which thereby enable warlords to continue processes that reproduce the entire system of production and exchange. Right? It's a different perspective on the military entertainment complex that we've all read about in Games of Empire. So in a way here, games are very intimately connected with both the material and the discursive side of all of these most unsustainable processes where we exploit and destroy this planet and her people for no really clear reason, right? The underlying logics of conflict, if we teach a 101 class in games, oh, conflict is an easy way to create tension. Mario jumps on the Goomba, obstacle, action, overcome, right? Like all of these kind of things that we take for granted for the genre, they are still the heritage of that. That might also have an upside though, because games being so intimately connected to all of this might mean that they could be one of the first dominoes that tip over something bigger. Right? They are connected to the technological superstructure that is controlling all of this, and they are a very, very central part to the cultural backdrop that normalizes all of these other structures. Here we are. That means that this could be an interesting starting point for doing something about it. And this is exactly where then also our next chapter leads to. We have a chapter from Arnaud, which is our way of picking up people from there. He has this amazingly positive way of writing and also talking about what we can do, right? He's like, make games, every game green, start wherever you are, and has created these matrices of, here you can think about all of the goals for sustainability that you could put into your game, see how you could match that to what your game already is doing, what are the topics that it's touching, what is the interests that the group, that your developers and your colleagues already have, and has developed this tool, this unique impact potential way of formulating that, where you can go through these steps and figure out, okay, so who are my co-developers? What are they already interested in? Who's our target audience? What are the things they care about? In which ways can our game sort of push them to act on that or think about that differently? That can help you start from everywhere. And he has this really positive way of thinking about it, right? So he says that, so that when our grandchildren ask us, what did you do when you learned about the climate crisis? We can proudly tell them we made video games, right? As an act of resistance. So I think that is really like a positive way. And I want to take that with us as well. Then some selected perspectives. We have also chapters from that I think are interesting things to keep in mind. We have, for example, a chapter from a games journalist, David Lump here, speaking about, in this case, how if you're making a climate game, you can get that to be visible and seen by relevant journalists to find traction and find your audience. But games journalism is something that we think often forget if we think about what kind of impact we could have. How could we make our perspectives visible to journalists, be discussed, and then that way presented to players? We have, for example, in work around critical journalism around working conditions in the games industry, we've seen that has become a bigger topic. Sustainability could be the next one, where also games journalists and games reviewers pick that up in a sort of more regular way of doing it. We have a chapter from Cindy Parimba, Kara Stone, Ian Garrett, and Ben Abraham. Cindy has already been presenting here, right? So that is where they are writing about this process of making games off-grid and how that makes you think differently about that and how to do that. So how the process of making it. And then we have two chapters about the content of games, one from Danielle, who's a graduate from our master program, but also has been a producer in a local game studio. They have been working in a game that was called Among Ripples. It was a game about restoring small bodies of water. And the really interesting takeaway for them was that they wanted to make a game that isn't like a capitalist game of making more and more money. It was for them about restoring nature here. But they realized that this idea of you have a body of water, you want to restore it, you need some resources for it, and you get resources back. Wait, we're building a management simulation of something. Is this a theme park simulator, but with bodies of water? Where does the financial returns come from? And they realized that the basic assumption, like the spinal cord of this genre that they were sort of building towards, was extractive. It was a capitalist logic of how you make something as a commodity and then make more money and then build bigger. But that wasn't what they wanted to do. So they had to really rethink deeply the genre conventions of this game that they wanted to build. It wasn't just, oh, we're just going to make, oh, why? There's all of these assumptions. They don't match our message. We need to really engage with this on a much deeper level. And I think one of the ways that this has worked out, even though we've also seen some critique on that, is Terra Nil, which is a game that is, at least on some level, quite clearly going away from a humanist or human-centered perspective where you need to build more and get more, but instead you can get to the point where you are restoring nature and the environment, take away all the human structures, and it can just be and be beautiful by itself. So it's decentering the human and extractive versions of that. So this need of really deeply considering how these sort of genres and established logics function if we want to really work with sustainability questions. A few more interesting perspectives. We have a chapter from Clayton here, trying to figure out how people that play games that really engage them about topics they already care about, for example, vegetarian diet or something like that, still fail to inspire long-term behavioral change if the players are left by themselves. So what they very, very clearly find here is that for players to change their behavior based on the game, even if they are the perfect audience and target group, they need a community. They need somebody else to do this together with. By themselves, that doesn't function, right? So it's really highlighting that you need, number one, you need to build community for anything to function like this. Then another game here from Ossian Nordkin and Christopher Waske looking at defiant games and games that have been made as resistance, as part of resistance movements from people that are wanting to communicate something about, okay, so this is how the resistance movement works. So that's really like a growing perspective here, an emergent perspective that we didn't see coming here. So it's really interesting. And finally, the last one that I wanted to lift up here from Jennifer Staris, highlighting how her experiences as an activist have been shaping also her work as a game designer. And that is somebody who has been working on Subway Surfers, which has like, was it 4 billion downloads or something like that, maybe more by now, and recently published Monument Valley as this sort of really beautiful way of communicating about sustainability and connections to the environment. That leaves as the last chapter that I wanted to lift up and relevant for us, my own, trying to figure out what this systemic change could mean in practice. And here I'm trying to bang my head against how we could communicate the need for building these sort of collective structures together. And the first part of that was trying to inspire people in a way that isn't necessarily citing geopolitical structures and the political economy of the tech infrastructure, but doing something else. It's, for example, the short story that I told you right in the beginning about the student and their sustainability game, right? So it's an attempt to find ways of communicating that on a more human level and a more digestible level. But it's also trying to figure out, oh God, I'm stuck again. It's also trying to figure out how we can think about doing this collectively from wherever we are, right? So here the idea is that if we see this matrix of individual versus collective action and discursive versus material action, then the pathway that we recommend, or that I recommend here, is go from the individual and discursive. You're individually by yourself starting to think about this differently, but first to a collective, build a group. Don't focus on what can I as an individual do differently, but focus on who are the other people that I can get with me that I can convince so that we can do this together. Which is, of course, exactly what we're doing here, right? So that is exactly the point of getting other people together and building a group and seeing what we can do to then create collective material change. Thinking through this from the perspective of a game studio, for example, this could mean that, and I figured that you cannot probably read this one now, but it's on Discord, right? So instead of figuring out how your actions as a programmer or like designer have impact on the carbon emissions of your game, learn together with the rest of your studio, see who else you can pull with you and convince that this is important. Find best practices, share them with the rest of the studio, then share them with the rest of the industry. Figure out frugal design guidelines for this particular game that you're making or this sort of indie scene, and see how your studio then can be the starting point as an individual in a larger process and get other studios engaged, and then maybe have the collective be the entire indie community in your town or in your country, and see what kind of actions or changes you can create here, right? And some of this is really that, and there's of course interesting starting points. In the presentation in the Sustainable Games Alliance that we just had last week, where also Bart was part of it, Hugo Biller, as one of the co-founders of the IGDA, presented his work here, for example, with this building this interface for the graphics and settings menu of one of their games, Ultros. And you see this little, this big red bar here. This is a way of indicating to the player how much energy this game will burn while you're playing it based on which graphics setting you're using. Right? And this is 4K resolution, so then it gets red and super high. And if you go down to HD and reduce the refresh rate to only 30 hertz, then suddenly, oh, it drops, it's only a quarter, right? Even the simple representation of energy use through gaming is something that players don't normally have access to. We hide that information, right? Generally, and in most of the places where we are working, we are hiding the impact of the things that we're doing from the public. That is so this is a way of changing that. And it should even fit into all kinds of political perspectives. If you talk about customers making informed decisions and competitions on the market, well, then show your costs, right? Then have a fair competition. That would even be part of that, right? So that could be one step that you can do individually, but then also share it, make it available to others, which is of course exactly what they're trying to do, right? So this is also what I would like us now to do together. The idea is that in a second, I will ask you for the second part to form groups and figure out where you could build a community like that around a topic that you care about. Just before that, the takeaways from this short talk, and we can of course also have some questions. Number one is there's already people that care about these issues, deeply care about these issues in probably every game studio, every university department, every organization. Finding them and empowering them or connecting to them is probably a really good first step. There's some low-hanging fruits and things that we can do and that we can achieve. It's a good idea to start with them because it's a good idea to have a starting point where you can accomplish something practically, right? And it's really good to have this, oh, you can start wherever you are moment, but you also need to have this systemic change as your guiding star, as your goal at the end of this is where we want to go. It cannot just end with the first step. Then we're ending up with only incrementalism and don't really change the things that need to be changed. If we're looking at how we want to make games and make this change through the content of our games, then often this can mean, right? Remember the example from the Among Ripples game, the restoring water bottles, challenging our deep and systemic assumptions about what games are and how they function. Because just reproducing or reskinning a game that exists, that might also just reskin the destructive logic that you're trying to deal with in the first place. Be vigilant for greenwashing, right? Of course, that can happen even though you have your best intentions, so really keep your eye out for that. Making games as a part of social movements is a really good idea that seems to come up more, so we should really consider that. Building larger collectives to work together, and of course, also the goal is to change how we think, but also how we make society.